A 24-year-old man walked toward his own airplane on a quiet January morning in Athens, and 15 seconds later, he was lying broken on a runway, gone before his father could even reach the hospital. Within just 29 months, 3 more members of that same family would be dead, and a Greek newspaper, writing the obituary for the family's final tragedy, simply called them a dynasty of death, a refugee who built an empire from nothing. Long before the private islands and the multi-billion-dollar shipping fleets, Aristotle's Socrates Onassis was simply a teenage refugee fleeing for his life. Born on January 20th, 1906, in Smyrna, a thriving port city then part of the Ottoman Empire, Aristotle's comfortable childhood ended abruptly in 1922, when Greek forces were driven out of the region and the city descended into catastrophic violence during what became known as the Great Fire of Smyrna. His family lost virtually everything in the chaos, and Aristotle himself fled the destruction with barely anything to his name, eventually making his way across the Atlantic to Buenos Aires, Argentina, arriving with, by most accounts, no more than a modest sum of cash in his pocket and an overwhelming determination to rebuild whatever his family had lost. That early experience of losing everything overnight, of watching an entire prosperous world collapse within a matter of days, would shape Aristotle's relentless drive for the remainder of his life, instilling in him a level of ambition and risk tolerance that few of his eventual business rivals could ever truly match. Working first as a telephone operator and gradually moving into tobacco importing, Aristotle displayed an extraordinary talent for business almost immediately, and within just a few years, he had accumulated enough capital to purchase his first cargo ships during the depths of the Great Depression, buying vessels at rock-bottom prices from companies desperate to offload their fleets. A bold and characteristically unconventional move at a time when most investors were retreating from risk rather than embracing it. It proved to be one of the most consequential financial decisions of the entire 20th century. Over the following decades, Aristotle built an enormous shipping empire, eventually controlling one of the largest privately owned fleets of oil tankers in the entire world, along with substantial holdings in aviation through Olympic Airways and an extraordinary personal fortune that made him one of the wealthiest men alive, a fortune that would eventually stretch across private islands, luxury yachts, and an art collection that rivaled those of some of the world's most prestigious museums, all built by a man who had, just decades earlier, arrived in South America with nothing but ambition and the will to survive. In 1946, Aristotle married Athena Mary Livanos, known to nearly everyone as Tina, the daughter of another powerful Greek shipping magnate, a match that brought together two of the most prominent families in the entire shipping industry, uniting two dynasties whose combined wealth and influence would come to dominate international maritime commerce for decades to come. Tina was just 17 years old at the time of the wedding, a considerable age gap between the two that raised some eyebrows even within the socially permissive circles of post-war European high society, though the marriage was, at least in its earliest years, widely regarded as a genuine love match, rather than simply a strategic business arrangement between two powerful shipping families. The couple would go on to have 2 children together, a son and a daughter, who would each inherit not only their father's extraordinary wealth, but also, many would later come to believe, a pattern of tragedy that would follow the family with almost supernatural consistency for the rest of the century. The marriage that shocked the world. Aristotle and Tina's first child, a son named Alexander, was born on April 30th, 1948, followed roughly 2.5 years later by a daughter, Christina, born on December 11th, 1950. Both children spent much of their early years being raised across France, Greece, and England, frequently placed in the care of nannies, tutors, and boarding schools, while their father's business empire and increasingly high-profile social life consumed the vast majority of his attention. A childhood defined by extraordinary material comfort, alongside a distinct lack of the kind of stable, consistent parental presence most children take for granted. A dynamic that both Alexander and Christina would later reflect on in various interviews and personal accounts as having shaped their own struggles with trust and stability well into their adult lives. The marriage between Aristotle and Tina began to unravel by the late 1950s, driven by Aristotle's increasingly public and increasingly serious affair with the world-renowned opera singer Maria Callas, one of the most celebrated performers of her generation, and a woman whose own extraordinary talent and international fame rivaled that of nearly anyone else in Aristotle's orbit at the time. The relationship became one of the most talked-about scandals in international society, playing out across newspaper headlines around the world as Aristotle's marriage to Tina finally collapsed entirely, with the couple divorcing in 1960. For young Alexander and Christina, then only children themselves, the divorce marked the beginning of a lifelong pattern of instability that would follow both of them well into their own adult lives, one defined by shifting family loyalties, competing loyalties between parents, and an ever-present awareness of just how publicly their family's private drama continued to unfold in front of the entire world, with every new development covered extensively by gossip columns and society pages across multiple continents. Aristotle's relationship with Maria Callas continued for nearly a decade following his divorce from Tina, but it too would eventually be cast aside in favor of an entirely different and considerably more famous romantic connection. In 1968, Aristotle married Jacqueline Kennedy, the widow of assassinated American President John F. Kennedy, in a union that instantly became one of the most closely watched celebrity marriages of the entire 20th century, drawing intense global media coverage, given both parties' already extraordinary levels of fame and their respective families' already well-established connections to tragedy. A pairing that struck many observers at the time as an almost inevitable convergence of two of the world's most scrutinized and misfortune-marked families. Both Alexander and Christina reportedly pleaded with their father not to go through with the marriage, having developed a genuine distrust of Jacqueline that neither of them ever fully overcame, and the relationship between Christina in particular and her new stepmother remained cold and distant for the entirety of Aristotle and Jacqueline's marriage, a tension that reportedly persisted even during the family's most difficult and vulnerable moments in the years that followed, with Christina rarely, if ever, describing their relationship in warm terms during any of the interviews she gave later in her own life. It was a fractured, complicated family dynamic that set the stage for an entirely different kind of tragedy, one that would strike with devastating suddenness just a few years later and permanently alter the trajectory of the entire Onassis family's story. Neither Alexander nor Christina could have known, as they navigated their father's increasingly public romantic entanglements throughout their teenage and young adult years, just how little time remained before their own family's story would take its darkest and most irreversible turn of all. A turn that would arrive not through scandal or public embarrassment, but through the kind of sudden, senseless accident that no amount of wealth, fame, or careful planning could have ever anticipated or prevented. 15 seconds that changed everything. By the early 1970s, Alexander Onassis had positioned himself as the clear heir apparent to his father's shipping and aviation empire, taking on the role of president of Olympic Aviation, a subsidiary of his father's larger airline that operated a fleet of light aircraft and helicopters throughout Greece. Alexander had taken his first flying lesson back in 1968 and had since accumulated roughly 1,500 hours of flight experience, earning a professional pilot's license and frequently flying medical emergency missions himself. transporting patients from remote islands and mountain villages to hospitals capable of treating them, work that gave him a genuine sense of purpose, entirely separate from simply inheriting his father's business empire someday. On January 22nd, 1973, Alexander was scheduled to evaluate a potential new pilot named Donald McCusker for his father's fleet of air taxis. The two men, along with Aristotle's regular pilot, who was recovering from an eye infection and along for the ride, boarded a small amphibious Piaggio aircraft, planning to practice water landings between two nearby Greek islands, a routine training exercise that Alexander had conducted countless times before without incident, part of the everyday business of running an aviation operation that regularly ferried tourists and business travelers across some of Greece's more remote and difficult-to-reach locations. Just a few seconds after takeoff from the runway at Athens's Hellinikon airport, the plane's right wing suddenly dropped and refused to level out again, and the aircraft crashed within roughly 15 seconds of leaving the ground, a catastrophically brief flight that left Alexander with devastating, unsurvivable head trauma, while both McCusker and the regular pilot survived the crash with serious injuries of their own, injuries that would keep them hospitalized for weeks, even as the far more devastating outcome of Alexander's own condition quickly became the singular focus of everyone involved. Aristotle and his wife Jacqueline immediately flew in from New York, bringing along a leading American neurosurgeon in a desperate attempt to save Alexander's life, while Alexander's mother Tina rushed in from Switzerland, accompanied by her current husband, and Christina flew in urgently from Brazil, where she had been staying at the time, a family scattered across 3 continents suddenly converging on a single Athens hospital in a desperate, coordinated effort to save the young man at the center of their extended, fractured family, setting aside years of accumulated tension and estrangement in the shared, urgent hope of saving his life. Aristotle went even further, flying a renowned British neurosurgeon named Alan Richardson directly from London to personally examine his son, sparing no expense or effort in his attempt to secure any possible chance of recovery. A final, desperate demonstration of a father's love that no amount of wealth could ultimately translate into a different outcome. The prognosis, when it finally came, proved devastating beyond any hope of recovery. Alexander died on January 23rd, 1973, roughly 27 hours after the crash, at just 24 years old, from a brain hemorrhage that no amount of his father's wealth or influence could ultimately reverse. For Aristotle, the loss proved to be an almost unbearable psychological blow, one from which those closest to him later said he never truly recovered. He reportedly grew convinced, at least privately, that the crash had not been a simple accident at all, but rather an act of deliberate sabotage carried out by one of his many business rivals, a suspicion that, whether grounded in any real evidence or simply a desperate father's attempt to find meaning in an otherwise senseless tragedy, consumed him for the remainder of his own shortened life. Business associates who knew him during this period described a man obsessively reviewing every detail of the crash investigation, unwilling or unable to accept that his son's death had simply been the result of a mechanical failure and tragic circumstance, rather than deliberate malice from an unnamed enemy, hiring his own private investigators to comb through every available detail of the accident in hopes of uncovering evidence that officials had somehow missed. He even briefly considered having his son's body cryogenically frozen before ultimately being persuaded against the idea, choosing instead to have Alexander embalmed and buried on Skorpios, the family's private Ionian island, in a small chapel that would soon come to hold more of Aristotle's own family than he could have ever imagined losing so quickly. But Alexander's death, as devastating as it was on its own, marked only the beginning of an extraordinarily brutal stretch for the Onassis family, one that would claim 2 more lives within just a few short years, and leave the family's very name permanently associated with the idea of an inescapable curse. 29 months of devastation. The losses that followed Alexander's death arrived with a speed and concentration that struck even hardened observers of international high society as genuinely extraordinary. Just over a year and a half after burying her son, Alexander's mother, Tina, who had since remarried Aristotle's own longtime shipping rival Stavros Niarchos, died suddenly on October 10th, 1974, at her Parisian home, at just 45 years old. A death that arrived with a suddenness that shocked even those within the family who had already grown accustomed to devastating news over the preceding 2 years. Officially, pathologists attributed her death to acute pulmonary edema, a dangerous accumulation of fluid in the lungs, though the circumstances surrounding her passing also raised persistent suspicions of a possible drug overdose, suspicions that were never fully or publicly resolved, adding yet another layer of mystery to a family history already defined by more questions than answers. Her daughter Christina would later pursue legal action against Niarchos over her mother's considerable estate, a bitter dispute that added yet another layer of pain and public scrutiny to an already devastating loss, one that placed Christina in the difficult position of publicly contesting the very man her mother had chosen to spend her final years with. A legal battle that dragged on for years and that further strained an already fractured extended family. Aristotle himself, still reeling from the death of his only son and now grieving his former wife as well, saw his own health deteriorate rapidly throughout this same period. He had been diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a progressive autoimmune disease that gradually weakens the body's muscles, a condition doctors believed had likely been developing for some time before symptoms became severe enough to attract serious medical attention. And friends who had known him for decades described a man who seemed to shrink both physically and emotionally in the aftermath of Alexander's death. The once formidable business titan transformed into what several close associates described as little more than a shell of his former self. His once legendary energy and confidence replaced by an exhaustion that seemed to deepen with each passing month. Aristotle Onassis died on March 15th, 1975, at the American hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine, France, at the age of 69, officially from respiratory failure connected to his illness, though many who knew him best remained convinced that grief itself had done as much to end his life as any physical disease ever could. A man who had survived war, displacement, and ruthless international business competition ultimately undone, in the eyes of those closest to him, by the simple and devastating loss of his only son, a loss that seemed to strip away the very resilience that had once carried him through so many earlier hardships across the course of his remarkable life. In the span of just 29 months, Christina Onassis, now the sole surviving child of Aristotle and Tina, had lost her brother, her mother, and her father, one after another, an almost incomprehensible concentration of loss that left her at just 24 years old as the sole heir to an enormous fortune she had never particularly wanted the full weight of inheriting alone. A burden that arrived not as a triumphant windfall, but as the final devastating chapter of a family story that had unraveled with almost unbelievable speed right in front of her. It was a fortune that would go on to define, and in many ways continue to torment, the remainder of her own increasingly turbulent life, one that would carry her through 4 failed marriages and toward an ending eerily reminiscent of the very tragedies that had already claimed the rest of her immediate family. Those closest to Christina during this period described a young woman who appeared genuinely shattered by the rapid succession of losses, struggling visibly to process not only her own grief, but the sudden, overwhelming responsibility of managing one of the largest private fortunes in the entire world. A fortune that could not buy happiness. Following her father's death, Christina Onassis inherited the majority of his considerable estate, roughly 55% of the total fortune, with much of the remainder directed toward a charitable foundation established in her late brother Alexander's memory, alongside a settlement provided to her stepmother, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, an arrangement carefully structured in Aristotle's will to ensure his son's memory would continue benefiting future generations even after his own death. Christina found herself, almost overnight, transformed into one of the wealthiest women in the entire world, a young woman whose childhood had already been marked by profound instability and whose entire immediate family had now been wiped out within less than 3 years, leaving her to navigate both grief and an overwhelming new set of business responsibilities almost entirely on her own, with few people in her life who could genuinely understand the particular weight of what she was now being asked to carry, and with a global media apparatus already primed to scrutinize her every move, given how thoroughly her family's story had already dominated headlines for years. Christina's search for stability and genuine connection led her through an extraordinarily turbulent series of marriages throughout the following decade, a pattern that friends and biographers alike often attributed to her desperate, ongoing search for the kind of unconditional love and stability that had so often eluded her during her own fractured childhood. Her first marriage, to a middle-aged Los Angeles real estate agent named Joseph Bulker, took place in 1971 when Christina was just 20 years old, a union her parents had opposed from the very beginning, and that lasted less than a year before ending in divorce, an early sign of just how difficult it would prove for Christina to find lasting happiness despite her extraordinary wealth and social standing. Just months after her father's death in 1975, Christina married a second time, to Alexander Andreadis, an heir to another prominent Greek shipping family, a marriage that likewise collapsed within roughly 14 months. In 1978, she married a third time, to a Russian shipping agent named Sergei Kauzov, a union that ended in divorce the following year, a relationship that had reportedly begun during business negotiations connected to one of her father's old shipping contracts, adding yet another layer of complicated family business history to an already tangled romantic life. It was Christina's fourth and final marriage, to French businessman Thierry Roussel in 1984, that finally produced the child she had long wanted, a daughter born on January 29th, 1985, whom Christina named Athena, in honor of her own late mother, a name that carried enormous symbolic weight given everything the Onassis family had already endured by that point. Yet even this marriage proved unable to escape the pattern of betrayal and heartbreak that had defined so much of Christina's adult romantic life. She discovered that Roussel had fathered a child with his longtime mistress, a Swedish model, during the very course of their marriage, a betrayal made all the more painful by the fact that the mistress's child had been born only months after Athena herself, and Christina ultimately divorced him, though she chose to raise her young daughter Athena largely on her own, determined, by all accounts, to give her child a considerably more stable and grounded upbringing than she herself had ever experienced, growing up scattered across boarding schools and continents, a promise she made both to herself and to those closest to her in the months following her final, painful divorce. That determination, however, would not be given the time it needed to fully play out. On November 19th, 1988, while staying at a friend's home in Tortuguitas, just outside Buenos Aires, Argentina, Christina Onassis was found unresponsive in a bathtub by her maid. She was just 37 years old, and the death of the last remaining child of Aristotle Onassis instantly reignited the very same tragic narrative that had already defined her family for over a decade, sending shockwaves through international society that echoed the very same disbelief and grief that had followed her brother's and father's deaths years earlier. A family that had briefly appeared, at least on the surface, to be moving past the worst of its extraordinary run of misfortune, only to find itself once again at the center of global headlines, mourning yet another sudden and premature loss. The question that was never fully answered. In the immediate aftermath of Christina's death, an initial autopsy indicated that she had died of a heart attack brought on by acute pulmonary edema, with officials explicitly noting no immediate evidence of suicide, drug overdose, or foul play. Findings that friends and family members publicly seized upon as clear proof that her death had simply been a tragic, unforeseeable medical event, rather than anything more troubling. A narrative that offered at least some small measure of comfort to a family already exhausted by years of speculation and public scrutiny. Yet subsequent toxicology reports told a more complicated story, later revealing the presence of significant quantities of barbiturates, powerful sedatives, in her system at the time of her death, specifically identifying a particular medication among several found in her room at the time. A discovery that suggested the underlying cause was considerably more complex than the initial reports had first indicated, even as investigators ultimately maintained that no evidence pointed toward an intentional overdose, leaving the precise circumstances of her final hours shrouded in a level of ambiguity that has never been fully resolved, even decades later. Greek newspapers covering the story at the time struggled to find adequate language for what had befallen the family, with one prominent daily publication describing Christina's sudden death as closing a circle that carried all the hallmarks of a genuine Greek tragedy, going so far as to label the Onassis family a dynasty of death in its coverage of her passing, a phrase that would go on to be repeated in international coverage of the family for years afterward. Friends who had spoken with Christina in the days before her death insisted she had seemed genuinely happy at the time, even reportedly developing a romantic interest in the brother of the friend hosting her in Buenos Aires, details that only deepened the sense of shock surrounding just how suddenly and unexpectedly her life had come to an end. A young woman who, by all outward appearances, had finally seemed to be finding a measure of genuine peace after so many years of turmoil. Christina's funeral took place on November 20th, 1988, in a private Greek Orthodox service held at the small chapel on the family's island of Skorpios, and she was buried in the Onassis family plot alongside both her father and her brother, completing a devastating and now nearly complete family gravesite that had, within the span of just 15 years, come to hold 3 members of the same immediate family, a small chapel on a private Greek island that had transformed, almost unimaginably, into one of the most quietly tragic burial sites connected to any wealthy family of the entire 20th century. Mourners who attended the private service later described an atmosphere of near disbelief among those present, many of whom had also gathered at that very same chapel to bury Alexander 15 years earlier and Aristotle 13 years before that. A small circle of family and close associates forced to return again and again to the same quiet island grounds to lay yet another Onassis to rest. She left behind her only child, 3-year-old Athena, who instantly became, at that impossibly young age, the sole surviving heir to what remained of the once legendary Onassis fortune. A young girl who would spend the remainder of her childhood being raised largely by her father in France, permanently shaped by a family history she was too young to fully understand at the time, but that would follow her for the rest of her life, regardless. The last Onassis, growing up in the shadow of a curse. Athena Onassis grew up primarily in France under the care of her father, Thierry Roussel. Though her upbringing remained closely overseen by a group of trustees her mother had specifically appointed before her death, individuals tasked with managing the substantial Onassis inheritance that would eventually pass to Athena once she came of age. These trustees, often referred to in media coverage of the time as the Greybeards, maintained tight control over virtually every expenditure made on Athena's behalf throughout her childhood and adolescence, a level of financial oversight that occasionally created friction with her father, who at one point reportedly threatened to relocate the family entirely rather than continue operating under such restrictive terms. Frustrated by the layers of bureaucratic approval required for even relatively modest expenses connected to raising his own daughter, an arrangement that reportedly grew increasingly tense as Athena moved through her teenage years and began developing her own opinions about how her inheritance ought to be managed. By 1992, at just 7 years old, Athena was already being formally recognized in financial reporting as one of the world's youngest billionaires, a distinction that came with an almost unimaginable weight for a child still years away from fully understanding the scale of the fortune she stood to inherit, along with the deeply tragic family history that fortune represented, a designation that reportedly followed her throughout her school years, despite her father's efforts to shield her from the more sensational aspects of the surrounding media coverage. Photographers and journalists occasionally attempted to capture glimpses of her throughout her childhood and teenage years, though her father generally worked hard to shield her from the kind of intense, constant media attention that had followed nearly every other member of her extended family, hoping to give her at least some version of an ordinary upbringing despite her extraordinary circumstances, enrolling her in relatively conventional schools and encouraging her early passion for horseback riding as a genuine outlet rather than simply another symbol of the family's extraordinary wealth. When she finally turned 18 in 2003, Athena gained access to an inheritance estimated at several £100 million, instantly becoming, by most media accounts at the time, the wealthiest teenager anywhere in the entire world. Rather than providing Athena with any straightforward sense of security or happiness, that inheritance almost immediately became the source of a prolonged and closely watched legal battle. As she approached her 21st birthday, Athena found herself locked in an increasingly public dispute with her own father over control of her considerable assets, ultimately seeking to gain full authority over her grandfather's estate and the charitable foundation established in her late Uncle Alexander's memory. A legal struggle that dragged on for years and that once again placed the Onassis family name at the center of international headlines, this time centered on generational conflict over money rather than sudden, unexpected loss. It was, in its own way, simply the latest chapter in a family story that had already been defined for decades by exactly this same combination of extraordinary wealth and profound personal turmoil. Proof that even surviving the family's earlier tragedies offered no guarantee of a straightforward or peaceful adult life. Those who studied the Onassis family's history closely often noted a grim irony in the pattern, one where money that had been amassed through such extraordinary personal sacrifice and ambition seemed, generation after generation, to bring with it as much conflict and heartbreak as it did comfort and security. Where the last surviving Onassis stands today. In the years since gaining full control of her considerable inheritance, Athena Onassis has built a life for herself centered largely around competitive equestrian sports, a passion she has pursued with genuine seriousness and dedication for decades, eventually establishing her own horse breeding and training operation. Her devotion to the sport has taken her far beyond simply riding for personal enjoyment, developing into a genuine professional pursuit that has allowed her to build an identity and a reputation distinctly separate from simply being known as the last surviving heir to one of the 20th century's most famous fortunes, competing at an internationally recognized level, and eventually building a substantial equestrian business that has earned genuine respect within the sport, entirely apart from her family's considerable wealth. In 2005, she married Brazilian equestrian Álvaro de Miranda Neto, known to many simply as Doda, a union that produced children together before the couple eventually divorced in 2017, ending a marriage that had lasted more than a decade, one built at least in part on their shared passion for competitive riding and horse breeding, a partnership that allowed Athena to build a family and a professional life largely centered around the very sport that had given her such genuine personal purpose since childhood. Athena has largely maintained a deliberately low public profile throughout her adult life, making only rare public appearances and generally avoiding the kind of extensive media coverage that had followed nearly every other member of her extraordinary family across the preceding decades. A choice that observers have often connected directly to the sheer volume of tragedy and public scrutiny. Her own mother, grandmother, uncle, and grandfather had all endured throughout their own very public lives. The Onassis fortune itself has also continued to evolve considerably since Athena came into her full inheritance. She eventually sold Scorpios, the family's private island that had once served as the family's most treasured retreat, and, tragically, the final resting place for 3 generations of her closest relatives, to a trust connected to a Russian entrepreneur. A decision that closed out one particularly symbolic chapter of the family's remarkable and often tragic history, transferring ownership of the very ground where her father, uncle, and mother had all been laid to rest to an entirely new family, with no prior connection to the Onassis name whatsoever. A transaction that many long-time observers of the family described as marking the true symbolic end of an entire era. Estimates of Athena's current personal wealth vary considerably depending on the source, and much about the precise scale of her fortune remains deliberately private, consistent with the low-key approach to public life she has cultivated ever since gaining control of her inheritance as a young woman, a discretion that stands in sharp and deliberate contrast to the relentless public attention that had defined nearly every other chapter of her family's extraordinary and often painful history. A legacy defined by both extraordinary wealth and extraordinary loss. Looking back across the full arc of the Onassis family's story, from Aristotle's remarkable rise out of the ashes of a burning city in Smyrna, to the successive, devastating losses of his son, his first wife, and himself within less than 3 years, and finally to his only remaining child's own turbulent life and mysterious early death. What emerges is one of the most genuinely tragic family histories connected to any dynasty of extraordinary wealth in modern history, one that so many observers around the world have come to describe, right alongside the Kennedy family's own well-documented misfortunes, as among the most thoroughly cursed bloodlines of the entire modern era. Few families anywhere have managed to accumulate such an extraordinary fortune while simultaneously losing so many of their own members to death, instability, and heartbreak within such a tightly compressed span of years. A pattern so relentless and so thoroughly documented in international media coverage that it has become almost impossible to discuss the Onassis name without immediately invoking the language of curses and inescapable tragedy. The comparison to the Kennedy family's own well-documented history of tragedy is not one the Onassis family ever sought for itself, yet the parallels remain difficult to ignore, particularly given how directly the two families' stories became intertwined through Aristotle's own marriage to Jacqueline Kennedy, a union that briefly connected two of the most tragedy-marked family dynasties of the entire 20th century into a single, almost unbelievable shared narrative. Both families built extraordinary wealth and influence across multiple generations. Both families captured the sustained fascination of the entire world's media apparatus for decades on end, and both families ultimately paid an almost unbearable price in the currency of sudden, unexpected loss, watching promising young lives cut short again and again in ways that no amount of money, influence, or medical care could ultimately prevent. A shared pattern that has led historians and casual observers alike to draw the comparison so consistently that it has become an almost unavoidable framing whenever either family's story is discussed in the decades since. What remains today is Athena Onassis, the sole surviving heir to a fortune built from nothing and maintained through decades of extraordinary business success, carrying forward a family name that continues to evoke both genuine admiration for what her grandfather managed to build and genuine sorrow for everything and everyone that family ultimately lost along the way. Her own choice to step back from public life, to build her adult identity around a passion for horses rather than the shipping empire or the social spotlight that had once defined her family's entire public existence, may well represent the closest thing to a genuine break from the pattern that has followed the Onassis name for the better part of a century, a quiet, deliberate rejection of the very visibility that had, for 3 generations before her, seemed to accompany every major chapter of her family's extraordinary and often devastating story. Whether her own choices ultimately prove enough to finally close the book on what so many have long called the Onassis curse remains, for now, a question that only time itself will be able to answer. Though her own quiet, steady approach to building a life defined by genuine purpose rather than public spectacle offers, at the very least, a meaningfully different template than the one nearly every other member of her extraordinary family was ever given the chance to follow. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.